The presidency has confirmed Russian President Vladimir Putin will not be attending the Brics Summit scheduled to take place at the end of next month. In a statement, the office says the decision was reached by mutual agreement. Let's get into it. We're now joined by Gustavo de Carvalho. He is a senior researcher and expert on Russia-Africa ties. Thank you very much, Gustavo, for your time this afternoon. So the statement from the presidency reads, by mutual agreement, President Vladimir Putin of the Russian Federation will not attend the summit, but rather the Russian Federation will be represented by Foreign Minister Mr. Sergei Lavrov. What do you read into that statement, in particular, by mutual agreement?
I think it's a very important step towards the preparations for the Brics Summits now in August. We've seen in the last couple of months on the impact that the ICC arrest warrant had in South Africa, particularly as it created a potential legal crisis in the country. South Africa is a signatory of the International Criminal Court statute, is obliged to comply with the decisions that are made by the court. And what we've seen in the last couple of days with the exchange of affidavits, with the exchange of rulings within the Gauteng High Court, it does provide an important opportunity to focus less on Russia as this vision of what Brics is, allow us to engage in really important discussions that is going to be happening in late August here in Johannesburg, whether it's in relation to the Brics expansion, whether it's in relation to the use of alternative currencies. And there was a fantastic risk in that regard that all of the focus of that would have been on Russia. And I think it's an important step towards more clarity in terms of what South Africa will be doing and not doing, but also enabling the country to move forward and focus on the Brics Summit as many of us are expecting now.
Absolutely. Let's focus on the Brics Summit, because a lot is being said about how this could potentially be a game changer. What are some of the items that you are looking forward to the most?
There's two items that I would say are the most important ones to be discussed this year. The first regards the expansion of Brics. The second time that we see Brics talking about an expansion, the first time was in 2011 when we were asked to join the grouping. This time is slightly different. This time what we see is more than 20 countries showing indication of interest to join the group, but there's still a lot of clarity that needs to be found when it comes to the criteria, when it comes to what types of countries we would like to see joining Brics, and particularly what is the timeline, and what is the impact on the decision-making aspects of Brics, which would have quite a lot of impact. The second issue that I would say is very important for us to look into towards the Brics Summit in August relates to the discussion about alternative currencies. Some call it the de-dollarization discourse, but I think it's more than that. Is that countries within Brics looking into how to reduce the risks of engaging with trade with only one currency? What are ways in which the countries can do to reduce some of the impacts that the use of the US dollar sometimes brings? And those will have direct implication for our trade balance, for our ability of engaging, especially when we see the US dollar getting very expensive at the moment and becoming very hard for countries in the global south to really benefit from global trade when it's very hard, when the dollar is that expensive.
It is often said that before the EU came to be, they also had teething problems. And so when we take a look at Brics, you suggest de-dollarization. What is it that countries, or some of the items that we need to get in order when we speak of getting our house in check? I can think of an instance where in Uganda, for instance, there are sectors of the population that are up in arms because of pharmaceutical companies from India that are providing cough syrups where it has led to the deaths of children. And so items for you that we need to get in order before we can actually pose, or while, actually, we can do it in conjunction, right, while we are setting ourselves up to compete against the dollar.
I think it's a very important question, and I think that at this stage we have more questions than answers. And some of those questions are, if we're talking about alternative currencies, which one is the alternative currency? Certainly within Brics, the initial feeling would be that the renminbi or the Chinese currency would be the one that would be utilized, but it's a very difficult to trade with, considering that the government controls very much how much the currency fluctuates. We've seen in recent weeks discussions about potentially pegging that trade currency or reserve currency to the gold, which would benefit some of its members. South Africa is a big producer of gold. Russia is a big producer of gold. India, there is a big gold industry in there. And certainly Brazil as well is a big producer of gold. So these are some of the options that are being referred to. I think the important aspect is that irrespective of what happens with those debates, no one is really expecting that the US dollar will change overnight as the main currency that is traded globally and that is utilized as currency reserve for most countries. I think what countries are looking for now are options, increasing the number of options of currencies that enable countries to reduce the costs and increase effectiveness when it comes to trade. The interesting thing is that none of those have been decided. And that's why the Brics Summit is so important. Many of those issues will be tabled during the summit in Johannesburg. And particularly, I think what I would be very interested to see happening is not necessarily a decision on what will happen with the expansion or what will happen when it comes to the debate on de-dollarization, but particularly that processes are set in place and enable us to see how that is evolving, and is evolving in a way that is beneficial for its members, including if we decide for an expansion.
The population of BRICS countries alone presents so much potential. And so what do we need to understand beyond the noise? Like you said, let's turn down the volume on Putin and take a look at what this body in its entirety presents, more so when we speak of long term, right?
Absolutely. BRICS it's a fairly new group. We're talking about 2009 from its creation. So it's not a grouping in that regard. What we have started seeing in recent years is that it became a very important platform for discussions around global governance, where there are claims from BRICS in terms of the reform of multilateral institutions like the UN, the World Bank, or the International Monetary Fund. And BRICS has increasingly gained momentum with that. We've seen BRICS more and more creating institutions. BRICS still as a group is fairly informal in many ways, but the creations of physical institutions like the New Development Bank or what some call the BRICS Bank can become, and I'm saying can because to a certain extent the New Development Bank still has much to develop, much to grow for it to be compared to other big international development financing institutions like the World Bank. But it does provide an important opportunity in terms of financing for development, especially on initiatives that may not necessarily be financed by other institutions. Finally, I think what we can see within BRICS is this increased interest from other developing nations that see that as a potential complementary grouping to the likes of the G7, for instance. So it's not replacing the G7, but it's really providing a platform for voices, a platform for interaction for these countries. But again, there is much that still needs to be thought through from the current members and potential new members, especially when it comes to decision-making institutions. We don't have a BRICS secretariat. So in that regard, there is much that will still need to be done. And the summit this year in Johannesburg will bring many of these questions that will have to be answered, or at least a process will have to be defined.
Oh, before we let you go, because when you take a look at the African Continental Free Trade Area, for instance, advocates for it will tell you about the free movement of persons on the continent. And so when it comes to the movement of persons between BRICS member states, what is your vision there?
We have not seen much in regards to that. There is no freedom of movement, for instance, between the BRICS members. What does happen often is at a bilateral basis. We haven't seen either the creation of trade agreements within BRICS or any type of preferential rates or within that. It could happen in the future, but right now it doesn't seem top of the agenda. I think what it is interesting for BRICS in that regard, especially if we start seeing other African countries, is the expectation that the African Free Trade Area, or AFCTA as we commonly call it, the more complementarity we see within African economies, the more we're going to see this linkage between those African members that are potentially members of BRICS, but also other types of arrangements. And I think this is the interesting of international relations. You don't need to be part of one group countries like South Africa usually are part of many different groupings, where is the G20, the African Union, SADC, the United Nations, and so on. And all of those have an implication. But we haven't yet seen BRICS playing such a major role when it comes to trade. It has a particular role in terms of global governance, of international organizations, of reforms, of currency. Maybe, who knows, maybe that is the next frontier of BRICS. But we still would have to wait and see what tangibly happens in that regard.
Yeah. Thank you very much for your time this afternoon. Gustavo de Carvalho is a senior researcher and expert on Russia-Africa ties at the ISS.